everyone. I'm very, very delighted, very happy that we are in fact having this launch, the UK and the Oxford launch of the Global Innovation Index here inside the heart of the Skoll Center. Because the topic for this year's report is so much both linked to the Skoll Center and also the very important focus and impact inside Oxford side. Let me use my few minutes just to give you a brief history of what the origin of the Global Innovation Index is and how it links to social entrepreneurship and WIPO. So I started the report back in 2007 when I was a professor at another school called INSEAD. And my motivation to create the report was really my sort of observation that a lot of the thinking about innovation in that time period focused on very traditional metrics. Very traditional metrics essentially driven by product innovation, process innovation, measured by metrics like number of patents, number of publications, number of citations, very usual typical metrics. And I was realizing and seeing that there's a lot of innovation happening in emerging markets which were not really being captured by the traditional metrics. A lot of innovation was happening from people who didn't have PhDs, people who didn't have patents, people who are being financed by other sources than venture capital. And I felt that somehow we needed a broader definition of innovation. So really, in some sense, the major contribution of the Global Innovation Index back in 2007 was to broaden the definition of innovation. And keep in mind, in those days, the definition of innovation was being set by the OECD in Paris. There's a group called the Oslo Group, Oslo Manual in OECD, and that is very traditional innovation focused. And for the first 4 years, I must say that it was a struggle for me because, here I was trying to write this report on a broader definition. And there was a strong pushback from colleagues and people in the field in OECD saying that this is not innovation. What you're talking about is general competitiveness. It's not really innovation. Till I was lucky in 2010. I met the Director General of WIPO, Francis Gurry, who was the previous Director General, and he and I got talking at Davos, and essentially he had a broader vision of transforming WIPO, which stands for World Intellectual Property Organization, to World Innovation Promotion Organization. So this link between IP and innovation, he wanted to make the transition. And he, in fact, got excited about what I was doing, and he brought WIPO into the equation. I can tell you that it's a very sensitive decision because, we had this ranking of countries, and for UN organization to go and rank countries is very sensitive. Because what happens, the UN ambassadors, essentially sometimes they get upset because the countries rank poorly, they say, it's not true, and why we rank poorly. And so it was a very interesting transition. With his leadership, with the support of the university, basically we transitioned the report as a collaboration between WIPO and INSEAD initially. Then as I moved to Cornell, WIPO and Cornell. And then over the next decade, essentially the 2010s, the report became increasingly very widely used. And I must say that WIPO's adoption of the report really helped change the debate on innovation. So slowly what happened was the OECD folks changed the definition of innovation. In the UN General Assembly and the UN sort of, various TRIP protocols and so on, the definition of innovation got changed because WIPO adopted it. So really, in many ways, I'm very delighted that this report today is not just widely used, it's used in more than 110 countries in the world actively, but has really, with the social entrepreneurship phenomenon, has come back to its roots, okay? The roots and the origin was that innovation is happening in ways which are not traditionally captured traditional metrics. And we know that many social entrepreneurs that we hear today from the case studies too are doing great work, but their innovation work is often not linked with IP and other kinds of more pattern-oriented thinking. And I think what I hope this piece of work does, and thanks to Marya and the entire Skoll team, is that it makes the link between social entrepreneurship, the impact, and IP a little bit more clearer, and the ways to think about IP as being more expansive as opposed to being restrictive. So that's really the goal out here. I'm delighted this is happening. And I'm delighted that all of us are out here to listen to some of the case studies. And before we listen to case studies, we'll have some words from Marco Aleman. Marco is the Assistant Director General of WIPO. And inside WIPO, the whole GII report basically sits in his domain. So with that few words of introduction, I hand over to the videotape of Marco Aleman, and then we'll get to the panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. While I regret not being there in person, I'm pleased to be back virtually at the Saïd Business School. The last time I was in that room was about 6 months ago during the School Work Forum to participate in our joint WIPO School Workshop on innovation in social entrepreneurship. We have come a long way since then. The ideas exchanged during that workshop indeed laid the groundwork for the recent release of the 2024 Global Innovation Index this year on unlocking the promise of social entrepreneurship. We decided at the time to focus on innovation in social entrepreneurship in this year's Global Innovation Index report. Why we did that? At WIPO, we have long studied innovation in its many forms, whether in health, environmental protection, or the rise of new technologies like artificial intelligence. But every so often, a new frontier in innovation emerged, one that challenged traditional paradigms and required fresh thinking and the merging of diverse schools of thought to inform policy. This year's theme of the Global Innovation Index on social entrepreneurship is one such frontier. Social entrepreneurship is a critical but often overlooked driver of innovation. While its transformative potential is well known within the social entrepreneurship community, it may not have received the recognition it deserves from innovation economists or from policymakers. Similarly, social entrepreneurs may not have fully tapped into existing innovation framework, missing valuable opportunities. The 2024 GII report seeks to bridge that gap. We have brought together leaders from both the social entrepreneurship community and the innovation ecosystem to shed light on the underexplored linkage between innovation and social entrepreneurship. Our finding shows that social entrepreneurship is a significant source of innovation, also addressing some of the world's more pressing challenges, whether it is creating affordable healthcare models for underreserved population in South Asia, or combating misinformation in high-income economies. Social enterprises are reshaping entire sector by introducing innovative practice that traditional models often overlook. Unlocking the full potential of social entrepreneurship requires a supportive ecosystem. The broader innovation ecosystem can learn from the agile, community-driven approaches of social enterprises. Likewise, social entrepreneurs can benefit from better integration into existing framework, using intellectual property and innovation finance to scale up their impact. Innovation policies may need to be recalibrated to the unique needs of social enterprises. With this new knowledge at hand, at WIPO, we are committed to helping social entrepreneurs use intellectual property to their advantage and supporting the journey from idea to impact. In recent months, I have met many inspiring social entrepreneurs whose work gives me the hope that together we can unlock a new wave of innovation. Let's ensure this isn't just an academic effort, but one that has real impact on the ground, including helping policymakers and institutions realize the true potential of social entrepreneurship. In closing, I would like to thank School Center, Dean Dutta, and Professor Besharov, and their teams for the valuable collaboration. I look forward to the discussions ahead. Thank you.
Joining us. from there. I want to particularly thank the co-authors of the report on social entrepreneurship, the special report, Kevin Miner, who's here, Sasha Vincent from WIPO, and also Anmal Grewal from WIPO. Anmal is joining us online. The four of us together co-authored the report on social entrepreneurship, which was very much a team effort, but it wasn't just us. We have Cynthia, who I'll introduce in a minute, who wrote the case studies. We have the amazing social entrepreneurs who contributed their insights and knowledge by sharing with Cynthia for those case studies, and a whole host of expert contributors, Jeru among them, who contributed a chapter. So really, this was a collective effort. And in many ways, it was a natural continuation of what Sumitra described as sort of the vision in founding the GII, was to think more broadly about innovation and focusing on social entrepreneurship. And the role of social entrepreneurship and innovation is very much part of that journey. At the same time, there was very much a meeting of two worlds that don't speak to each other all that much, and certainly don't always speak the same language. And so some of what we were really trying to do in the special report, and what we hope to do in today's conversation, and really what we do at the School Center, is about bringing those different worlds together and creating a space for conversation, creating a shared language, creating some common understanding, because there is much more that we could do, as Marco said, to help social entrepreneurs fully embed in and work with existing innovation ecosystems, policy frameworks, financing opportunities, and to help the innovation policy world and ecosystems and resources that are available there understand, work with, adapt to, and support social entrepreneurship. And that's really the spirit in which we're having today's discussion, and the spirit in which the whole report and set of work that led into it and that will follow from it is coming from. So with that as preamble, we're now going to get into the panel discussion. And I'll ask my fellow panelists to come up and join me up here, and we'll all take a seat and get into the discussion. So please come on up. And I'll just remind you to flip on your mics if you haven't. So we have a panel of folks here to get into the report and really to talk about the challenges, the opportunities, and the possibilities that can emerge from bringing these two worlds together, and from thinking about the role of innovation in social entrepreneurship and what it will take to really unlock that full potential. I'm going to start with Cynthia. So Cynthia Rayner is a lecturer and storyteller. She focuses on collective agency and how organizations and communities can work together to shape social systems. Cynthia currently works with us at the School Center as a visiting fellow. She's also a senior researcher and adjunct lecturer at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation at the University of Cape Town. And she's a PhD candidate there, nearly done with her PhD. But most importantly for today's discussion, she wrote the 14 case studies of social entrepreneurs and their ventures that accompany the report. Andrew Bastauris is CEO of Peak Vision Limited. Peak Vision was one of the 14 organizations profiled in Cynthia's case studies. Andrew is also an ophthalmologist and eye surgeon and professor of global eye health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He's worked and done research in over 20 countries, spent 2 years living in Kenya, where he led a major eye disease study and the development and testing of Peak Vision. He's also a TED Fellow, a Ashoka Fellow, Rolex Laureate, UBS Global Visionary, World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, and received an OBE for his service to eye health overseas in 2023. Andrew's work, of course, is featured in Peak Vision, and we'll hear much more about that today. And then finally, Jeru Bilmoria. Jeru has founded a number of innovative and award-winning social enterprises, the Child and Youth Finance International, Aflatun International, Childline India, and Child Helpline International. All of those have helped to enable financial inclusion, protection of children and youth in more than 180 countries. Most recently, Jeru founded One Family Foundation, which incubates and scales social innovations, and she's currently co-chair of Catalyst 2030. Catalyst is a global network working to accelerate progress towards the SDGs through social innovation at the country level. And Drew was the founder of Catalyse Innovation originally and has stepped into the co-chair role now. Drew is a Skoll awardee, a Ashoka and Schwab fellow as well. And as I mentioned earlier, she contributed one of the expert contributions outside chapters to the report. So welcome to all of you. So we're going to get into the discussion, and I want to talk first about sort of the main themes of the report. I mean, there's a 324-page report, there's outside chapters, there's the case studies, there's a lot of material there. And so reflecting on the whole package, I'll just ask each of you to share your thoughts on what are the key messages that you see in there about the state of entrepreneurship globally? What would you highlight for us? Cynthia, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so first I want to thank all of the organizations that spent their time with us. Like I said, these are busy organizations, yet they spent several hours, each of them, on Zoom with us, really discussing their models. And I also want to thank Sandhya Naidu Janardhan, who's here from Community Design Agency. She's joining us. She was also one of the case studies, so I just wanted to call out. And then lastly, I want to thank Catalyse 2030. So Catalyse 2030 is a network of 5,000 organizations, and these organizations provided us with the database to find these 14 case studies. We really went through the process of combing through this database and identifying some of the most exciting social entrepreneurs to highlight. And what I would say is that the learning that I came away with is just the breadth and the diversity of these organizations. We saw so many different types of organizations in this database, and then it was our kind of very difficult task to whittle it down to 14 of them. And really looking through that, I was just struck by the real range of different innovations. And what I would say is that when we talk about innovations here today, we should think not just about the innovations in products and services, which is, I think, kind of our first thing to think about, but also innovations in the way they work. So the way they work with constituencies, the way they create their organizational forms, the way they think about their workforce. All of those are things that these social entrepreneurs are using in their innovative models. And so I think if we can even expand our mind to think more broadly about innovation beyond just the products and services, then we can really find a whole lot more to talk about here today.
You're up, you're holding the mic.
Okay, so for me, what I read the report, and firstly, once again, thanks to the team which wrote it. It's really, really insightful. And you can see some of the tensions which you mentioned coming through. So that's really good. Thank you guys also for the opportunity to write this chapter and for the help which I got from Cynthia and Kevin when writing it. My learning over here, as I read the report and everything, is people are starting to get the breadth of how broad the sector is and how diverse the sector is. And I think that's something which the report has been able to capture, and that's something which is very important. Because very often when people think of social innovation or social enterprise, there's just one way of thinking. And the report is able to show, like Cynthia was also saying, the multiple variations. What I think is really interesting also taking from this report is the broad tent of social innovation. And we need to really build on this broad tent of social innovation and take it forward to the next level. So we are able to then start evolving and building the field. So I look at this report also, though, I have to say, because I'm always thinking about what's next in some ways and learnings. So my learning for what next is how are we going to develop the sector of social innovation, the field of social innovation, and what we need to do.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to be honest, I didn't read all 324 pages, so I'm going to put that out there. I did read some of it. There was a few things I took from it, but I'll maybe just highlight one or two specifically. One was, and I get this also from Catalyse 2030 as a network, realizing there are lots of people out there who are deeply passionate about solving problems. And I think most people who end up founding a social enterprise don't think of themselves as social entrepreneurs. They are just trying to solve a problem. And it's the journey of problem solving that tends to evolve. And it's so really almost a mindset or spirit around identifying an issue and unblocking it to then find another issue and just keeping going. That eventually leads to this place where you suddenly find there's an ecosystem that doesn't support this thriving in the way it would need to solve the most pressing social problems of our time. And I think what's encouraging in the report is there's lots of people trying. And actually this recognition now that there's a more meta level shift that is going to need to happen if we're going to move things to the next level. Some encouragement that it may happen.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up on this point and on something that Jeru said as well. So, I mean, you're talking about, Jeru, like what's next, right? And you sort of hinted at this as well, like where are we taking things? What's the shift? Who are we working with? And so just tell us a bit, maybe I'll start with you, Jeru, sort of the shifts that you've seen in the field and where you think we need to go and are sort of starting to go.
So I think okay, I'm ancient in the field, okay? So across the past 20, 30 years, what I've seen is initially when the name was coined, social enterprise, it was very much about the individuals. And I think the biggest shift I've seen over it is now it's become much more about the we. So it is about the person trying to solve the problem. So the hero, like with Ashoka, etc., when it initially started, it was about the social entrepreneur. The first shift I've seen, it's now about the social enterprise. And like what Andrew was saying about what is this pressing problem that everyone is trying to solve. What Cynthia has been focusing on also is the whole collective aspect, which has emerged much more. So that is again a recent trend and a shift which I am seeing. And I think what now is the next level I think we need to see is, and this is where the WIPO report really comes in, and the GI is, how are we going to now get this to the governments, where governments are able to look at social innovation the way it looks at any business, any sector. And this is where I'm sure, probably those of you who read the report, there's a chapter from Françoise and Werler, which talks about the scale of social enterprise, which says that, okay, I'm bad with numbers, so I won't try going there, but it's in trillions, and also that it's almost as large as the whole fashion industry. Yet no one thinks of us that way. So can we start getting governments and others to think of us as this huge sector which can play a major role in GDP contribution, which can really start shifting the economic paradigm we have it. And my dream in terms of shifts should be, in the next 10 years, 60% of the global economy should be a social innovation economy. And we are at that tipping point to make that happen. So I think, and this report plays a critical role in that.
So Andrea, I'd be curious to hear how you do this or are doing this or thinking about doing this within Peak Vision. Working, going to scale, working with governments, taking things to that next level.
Sure, so maybe I need to unpack a bit what Peak Vision is about. So just to give you a short version of a long story, I grew up vision impaired, and when I got treatment at the age of 12, my life changed. I went from seeing trees like out the window there, looking like these green blurs, to suddenly actually seeing leaves. And my life completely changed, and the trajectory of my life changed from that point on. And I've been obsessed ever since with what does it take for everyone to have good vision and everything that unlocks from learning, earning, thriving, connecting. And it's taken many forms, which has required me to change my role multiple times. So becoming a doctor, an eye surgeon, a public health doctor, and then a social entrepreneur. I didn't even know what a social entrepreneur was. I couldn't even manage my own current account, never mind run a business. And so that evolution has led to unveiling the problem at different points, from understanding that people don't know that they can't see. So I didn't know I couldn't see. I just was told I was not very good at school. So how do you create awareness about an issue in a huge group of people who don't know they have the issue? So almost that was phase one. And you can do that at the micro level. So we built software tools that allowed anyone to use a smartphone to do accurate vision tests in the community. But also, how do you raise awareness at the political level that this is an unfunded issue that is solvable? And then how do you make sure that it's not just finding those people, because that doesn't mean they're treated, they're just found. So how do you connect them to the services? And then having to join all these dots and build the relationships and the partnerships, and then the digital infrastructure that allows you to connect and refer people. And that's been a long journey of building a team, a product, almost a movement in ways which has created visibility in some of the places we're working around the issue. And I'll come on to more specifics about how we do it in the other questions, but this is a kind of shift that I'm seeing, and I think something Jeru talked about, which was really important in terms of how the sector's moving. Even the fact it's called social entrepreneurship, in the same way we talk about social investment, my hope is that one day we'll make the idea of entrepreneurship and investment that's not social will no longer be legitimate. Like, at what point is it okay that investment is extractive? At what point is it okay that entrepreneurship creates inequality and divide? Yet that is the status quo, but we don't say it. And so almost by saying social entrepreneurship and social innovation, my hope is that people say, I'm not going to work unless it's for a purpose. And the more this sector grows, hopefully the more that creates an illegitimacy around other types of extractive entrepreneurship and investment.
Well, I will say, just on that note, I mean, I think things are moving and we're making a lot of progress. And one of the signals of progress that I see here, that we see at the business school, is we are really embedding these ideas in our core courses, right? There isn't, in the entrepreneurship course is where we talk about all of this, not in a separate course, right? And we're embedding it into our courses on leadership, into our finance and accounting and marketing, and because it is at the core, right? Not a separate thing. I want to turn to and make explicit the topic of innovation, right? We're talking about the Global Innovation Index. And so I want us to talk a little bit about what does innovation look like in social entrepreneurship. And as Sumitra opened with, the whole idea of the GII is to think quite broadly about innovation, and social entrepreneurship as the focus for this year really takes that forward. In the report, we mentioned specific innovation activities, but the main emphasis is on the broad pathways through which organizations innovate. And really, innovation is in part baked into the whole organizational model and design of social entrepreneurship. It's about who are the customers and beneficiaries that social enterprises are engaging with, what kind of products and services are offered, who's employed in the organizations, and how are social enterprises really built to shift broader systems, not just to produce a particular product or service, but that's in the service of something broader. And so I want to engage, I'll start with you, Cynthia, just to ask you to reflect on these different innovation approaches and how you see them showing up in social enterprises. You looked deep for this work at 14 organizations, but you spent your whole career working with social enterprises that are innovating to create systemic change. And so what can we learn from that? About what you saw in terms of innovation models and pathways in these organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just emphasize that when we went into this research and we were meeting with these different organizations, we expected to see that each of them would have kind of a dominant pathway through to their innovation. So Marya mentioned the four of them. You know, there's the product pathway, there's the customer pathway, who they're innovating for, there's the employee pathway, who's the workforce, how are they engaging with them. And then the fourth one kind of came out of the research. We realized that, in fact, many of these organizations were not just innovating in those three areas, they were actually innovating in the process of building partnerships with different ecosystems actors. And so we started to call that the ecosystems pathway. And in fact, I had to modify my whole interview guide because, in fact, we were finding that this was not just something that the social entrepreneurs were mentioning as an aside, but in fact, they were bringing it up as a core part of their work. So I think that's the main thing, is that we kind of found this fourth one that was right there in front of our noses. And then in addition to that, like I said, we thought we were going to find a dominant pathway for each one. And although in the report we can highlight for each one, we can illustrate each of those pathways with a different organization, in fact, all of these organizations were innovating in all four of those areas. So it was difficult even for me to pinpoint, you know, is this a product style innovation organization or is it an ecosystem? In fact, all of these organizations were doing all four of those things, and they were pushing on different things when they needed to. So they were kind of using those different aspects of their business model or of their social impact model to actually change the way they worked over long periods of time. I'll just give a little bit of an example. So an organization called Soil in Haiti, they started out very much on the product pathway. They were trying to create toilets that could be used in homes, that could then be, the waste could be collected and then used as compost or made into compost. And what they found was that that was a good product and it was needed. But in fact, all of the different actors in the system were in fact not aligning to create a public good. And so in fact, what they really needed to do was pull together the pieces of financing, pull together the government actors, and actually create an entire ecosystem for the provision of waste services to these informal settlements. So that was just one example. Another one that I'll give is Fairtrasa. This is an organization that was working on kind of the distribution of fair trade produce throughout the world. And what they discovered was that in fact, their key role was not just as the distributor of fair trade product, but in fact, creating those connections between the consumers and the smallholder farmers who were actually the sources of those goods. And so now being that kind of end-to-end linkage is the way they serve the system in a much different role than what they envisioned in the first place. So you can see that innovation is an evolution, it's a process, and it's comprised of all of these things, not just one dominant pathway.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to come back to you. Tell us a little bit about how do these pathways resonate with your work and how you think about innovation?
Yeah, they do. And I'll kind of take you about how some of it, how it's evolved a bit in the way you've described there as well, in that initially our core work was understanding the patient pathway. Like, what journey do they have to go on? How do we make it visible? And in the very early days, over a decade ago, we were finding patients who were blind from cataract. And if you're familiar with cataract, it's a completely treatable condition. You can restore someone's sight in 5 minutes. But people have often been blind for a decade and they stay unnecessarily blind. And so the key thing is, how do you find them and get them to the surgeon who's going to treat them? And we tried various things, and our data was showing, and the first thing was that we were actually getting the data that showed how many people had we found who turned up for treatment. And we knew the biggest barriers to treatment were the cost of treatment and the transport. So we found a way to fund that, and it was subsidized, but still only 50% of people were coming, despite all those costs being covered, and we couldn't understand why. So we went a layer deeper in the data, and we saw that if you were from a particular ethnic group, you weren't turning up. And so whenever I was in the field and observing the conversation, which was in Swahili and then being translated to another language, there was a word used which was supaswaji. I could ask him, what does that word mean? He said, it means, operation or surgery. Because I'd sometimes see a reaction on the patient's face. And then in a completely different context, I heard someone else say the word. I said, what does that word mean? And they said, it means to butcher or to split. So these patients were hearing, it's great, it's free, we'll sort the transport out, and then we're going to butcher your eye. So not surprisingly, they didn't turn up. By just changing that word, it shifted from only 50% turning up to almost 80% turning up. And so it was one word that had that impact. And so if you like, the innovation was being able to uncover the root cause. And so what we've learned now is, rather than us being the innovators, we're creating the tools to give to our partners for them to be able to constantly ask the question. And so what started off with us kind of managing that whole pathway and learning, we're trying to shift the emphasis to what are the tools we need to make our partners innovators so they can solve the problems, because the problems are nuanced and they're different everywhere and they evolve. And that's continued in different forms over time.
Such a powerful example. It really, like, tuning into what's going on behind this, recognizing the limits of what you know or any one of us knows, and digging into what's going on in this context, and then turning over those tools. Thank you. Drew, I want to come to you. So we talked about the 4 pathways, and you have, if I look at your career, really focused on the systems innovation bit. And so tell us a little bit about what that looks like in your work, how you do that work, because systems innovation can sound sort of abstract. We talk about different parts of it, and some of it is doing the research, some of it is working with policymakers, some of it is shifting cultural norms. How have you done systems innovation work on the ground? What does it mean? What does it involve?
So
I'll start with one of my first organizations, Childline, because I think that started with a very classic problem. Street kids had nowhere to go in the night. So they wanted a place and they thought, all the social workers go away, 9 to 5 jobs. So that was the problem I set out to solve. But then came the problem that they said, we don't stay in Bombay. We want to go to Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, where the train takes us. So that became the second issue, which was to solve it. So that's where the idea of a phone service, which was across all of India, came, and the fact that it had to be 24 hours. So I think for me, Rio, the principle was learning what they wanted, and that was actually listening to them. So that became the only principle we used in Childline, and it still existed till we transferred it to the government last year. So what is the systems change that took place? As we started it, it started in Bombay. It's now in every district of India. That's 700 districts, and there are 11,500 people full-time working on trying to provide the services. That's an expensive thing. So the systems change was not trying to do it on our own. The systems change was involving the government once we did the initial pilot and letting the government take over. So that was the first thing. The second thing was also, as we created the model, not following the traditional model where one organization would grow so big, but shifting the models. I'm talking about 27 years back, and saying that it's going to be one small aspect of multiple organizations. So we had 1,500 partners implementing the service and around 9,000 partners supporting the service. So what we did is, instead of creating an organization, we created a movement for child protection. And because of the power, so Childline responded to around 10 million calls a year from child labor, abuse, the whole gamut of things. And by doing that, we were able to do three things. One, we got the government to start taking child protection seriously, where it doubled the child protection budget by 100 times. And we got them to change their policies on child protection totally. Then what we were able to do is we got them to start training all the systems people who were involved. And year before last, they actually took over the whole project. And now we are looking to see how can we get the 700,000 villages in India to create child protection services. So 3 levels of systems change: the individual looking at the child, behavior transition for the sector, because the sector had never worked with this sort of a model. And then the last is making government actually increase fund flow, shift policies, everything. I can go into many more examples, but I think this concretely shows the multiple levels. And I always say systems change is great, but really effective systems change is community organization, because you need to mobilize everybody to bring about the change you want. And I'll keep it at that one example.
Yeah,
as
no,
opposed
that's
to going to
fantastic. Okay, so I want to now dig in. So we talked a lot about innovation. We've talked about really this sort of systems innovation piece. And you guys described it as if it just happened and you just did it or you knew how to do it. We know it's not that easy. And so I want to unpick what is the work of leading these organizations. And you both described basically giving up control, right? And handing it over, teaching other people how to do what you do and you had learned to do, rather than sort of protecting it, owning it, and controlling it. And so I want to use that to unpick the work of leading in social enterprises and to understand, what does it take to do that as a leader? And how do you help your teams learn how to do that work? Because if we are going to scale these ventures and really unlock their potential, it can't just be isolated people, right? You've talked about the move from individuals to organizations to systems. We have to help other people learn how to see innovation in this way and how to give up and hand over and collaborate rather than owning and closing in. So, Andrew.
Big question. So I can think of a couple of stories, but probably the one that best answers that question is quite a personal moment around 12, 13 years ago, where my wife and I had left our jobs in the NHS. A lot of people were not too happy about it. We just had our first child. We were on the ladder of success. We were about to get a mortgage. I was about to become a consultant surgeon. But it wasn't what was in our hearts to do, and had this big idea that we could make some meaningful difference. And so that's when we moved to Kenya. And it all started off very optimistically with exciting stories of how it was all going to pan out, and then it went horribly wrong. So this is not the bit you get in the nice polished PowerPoints where it all looks like it just went smoothly. Because the reality is everything that went wrong, that could have gone wrong, did. We had things stolen from us. We had equipment go missing. We had some of our team take the money that was meant for the patient's treatment. We had threats to our own safety. Where we lived, you didn't know if the water would run or the electricity would work. And it got to the point where it was so stressful. And I'm a pretty chilled guy, but I was cracking my back teeth whilst asleep, through kind of gnawing at nighttime. And I just got to this point, I thought, I can't believe I've so naively stepped into this on this idea of making a change. I thought, have I actually tricked myself? I've managed to convince people to fund the work. My wife believes in me and she's quit her job. All these other people are kind of backing me. And actually, I think I might have made the whole thing up. I didn't really know who I could say this to, but I'd got to the point where I was starting to mentally resign from the work. So I was like, I can't see a way through. And I was going for a run with a friend called Joseph, who in the mornings would set out whilst it was early and cool enough. And we'd talk a lot whilst running, and I would sometimes vent about all the things going on. And it was definitely my turn to vent that day because I had plenty to vent about. And so I was just getting this all off my chest. And he knew why we were there and what we were trying to do. And we hit this hill, and then just as we were getting to it, he just stopped, turned me around, and just stared at me. He said, Andrew, you know when an aeroplane goes down the runway, it only takes off after it's hit its maximum resistance. He said, you're at that point now, don't stop. And then he ran off. I just stood there, and it was just like something shifted in me. It was like I let go. It was like, I kind of got to a point where I can't do this. But it didn't mean that I didn't have a role to play. I think I moved from being the hero trying to solve the problem to realizing I had a role in it, but I needed to basically take a leap of faith. And if it was going to work, it would work, and just kind of be on the ride. And that evening, I got a phone call from the Ministry of Health. And I know when the call came, I thought, it's going to be pack your bags, you need to go home. And it went something along the lines of, Andrew, do you still have that letter giving you permission to work here? It's like, yes, I do. He said, well, then you should continue. You're doing good work. I was like, oh, okay. And it just, from that point on, things started to unlock. And it took me to this point years later, realizing that I've hit that same place multiple times. So it's not like it was one breakthrough and then everything was great. I've hit that same place of just being totally stuck, can't get through, for a shift to happen. And I think in many ways, that's what leadership is getting to the point where you're willing to go beyond what you're able to do. And then people want to follow you because they'll see that when it gets hard, you will not give up on the purpose, even if you don't know how to do it. And I feel, incredibly blessed to be surrounded by a team now who are so passionate about the cause that I look around, I think, I know we will solve the problem, but I don't know how. And I think that's the best place to be in terms of trying to make it.
Thank you.
So I think you had a great story. I think I was very lucky. I was blessed early on with working with homeless men and with street kids. And I learned from street kids the spirit of bindas. That means basically, I don't know how to translate. It's joy in the smallest things. They almost never had anything, yet they always found joy. And I think for me, that was the most humbling learning. And I think that's what's carried me through. So I think I was lucky in being educated in that way of thinking, which is there. So, of course, all social entrepreneurs have ups and downs. Huh? And I think we also like a bit of the drama because all of us, honestly speaking, we have king size egos and we try to flush them down the drain, but it still exists. So let's be honest about that also. You know, and especially in the earlier stages of social enterprise where everyone would give those awards and everyone tended to think, oh, ha, 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 how great I am. All rubbish. Okay. But that was the culture at a certain stage. So there was a lot. So I think I was lucky that the street kids whom I worked with, and it also made me always create teams which told me how stupid I was very often. So I think it was very, very important. And I say that as a strategy, create a team which is going to constantly criticize you because that's what's going to be your mirror for change. So that's my one leadership learning, which I learned from the street kids. The second is, of course, letting go and always remember you're just a drop in the ocean. There are so many other things. So never ever let, and I think this is what my mom said, don't ever let your ego dominate your work. The third leadership principle was always trying to play the role of an honest broker. And this is something I've discussed with Cynthia multiple times, because the more people see you as neutral, the more they are going to trust you and the farther the work will go. And the last I'll add with an anecdote is in with Catalyst, when I knew it was perfect time to let go of Catalyst, and I think this is a very important leadership thing, is someone actually walked up to me and told me, you're a social entrepreneur, you should join Catalyst. You know, it's a great organization. And I was like, yay, I've succeeded. Because that's what you have to be as a leader. So much in the background and making things move, but people don't, you know, need to see it, know it, and be it. So I think that's leadership to me.
Okay, thank you. Cynthia, I want to turn to you because you've studied a lot of social entrepreneurs and their ventures over time in many different contexts. Looking across, right, you've probably heard so many really powerful stories about what has worked and also seen what hasn't worked. What have you observed? What would you pull out from those, that set of case studies and research? And in particular, I mean, we just heard really powerful stories from Jeru and Andrew about what does it take to persist, about how to remain humble and sort of lead from the back as much as from in front. And it's, yes, at some level, social enterprises are enterprises and they're all the same, but they're not, right? And this sort of challenge of the social mission and the economic viability is always there in a really powerful way. And so I'd be really interested to hear you speak to that bit in particular about the work of leading social enterprises and the balancing of the purpose with the, profit, whether it's, however it's deployed.
Oh my goodness, it's a big question. And even as you were speaking, Marya, I was thinking I could take it in so many different directions because of all of the things that I've learned from the social entrepreneurs, both in this project and in previous projects, and even as an employee within social enterprises, which was the work that I did before I retreated into academia. Well, first of all, in the case studies, in the research, Sandhya, Andrew, Jeru, everyone, when I asked that question of what enables you to do the work that you do, number one answer, my team. So it was definitely a recurring theme that these leaders of the organizations saw their teams as absolutely the critical component of what they were doing. And there were different themes about how they recruited, who they looked for, the talent, how they maintained motivation and passion within their teams. But actually, I'd like to take it in just a slightly different direction and just talk about one other theme that we saw across the research. And this was actually one of the answers that I had for the first question about what are the shifts that you see right now in social entrepreneurship. I'm seeing more and more this, it's an innovation mindset on the part of social entrepreneurs to think more and more about how do we bring the most proximate actors into the role of decision makers and leaders within our organizations. I mean, both of you have spoken about that. And I would say maybe 10, 20 years ago, when I first started working in these organizations and studying them, those weren't the answers that I was hearing. It was, again, more about the product and the service and clientele. It was more this idea that these were our clients and they were going to be the recipients of our services. But more and more over the last decade, the question has been, how do we enroll? How do we bring those constituencies into the fold and make them the leaders of the work that we are doing? And across the case studies, we saw that in many different ways. So in some cases, organizations were creating platforms for franchisees or entrepreneurs to then create their own businesses to deliver the services and the products that the organization had created. In other cases, like I mentioned for Trasa, actually creating cooperatives for shareholder farmers to come, smallholder farmers to come together and actually create their own relationships with producers and with distributors. And then many, many other examples of those. And we even struggled to find the name for it because we were kind of trying to fit all of that within the employee bucket. And employee didn't capture that at all. So I started using the term workforce. Workforce didn't capture it either. So I've started to use the term constituency. It feels to me that more and more organizations, social entrepreneurs are innovating in how they bring the most proximate actors to be the actual role player in the design of the products and services themselves. And I'm actually looking at Sandhya right now, and she's nodding her head. Sandhya runs an organization called Community Design Agency. Their innovation is actually the participatory processes that they use to design new housing projects. They bring the residents into relationship with the developers and they work on a co-creation process. And that's their innovation. When I talked to Sandhya's team, they said, it's not about the housing itself, it's about the process that we use to develop those. So each of the organizations had different ways of doing that. And I think it's one of the most exciting things that we can see across social entrepreneurship right now.
Thank you. And it very much links to this theme of giving up power, including more voices, spreading out, and getting greater engagement, getting closer to the problem, the people who live with the problem, the people who know the solutions on the ground. Okay, so we're going to come to questions from all of you in just 1 minute. I have one last question for you, which is, given what we've talked about how the field has shifted, the role of innovation, what it takes to lead, to unlock these innovations, what is needed for social enterprises to flourish? And what message would you give to policymakers or funders, investors who are seeking to really support the field?
I think we actually need to build the field still. We are very fragmented. We have a lot of pockets of doing a lot of fantastic things. So I think we need to talk to each other, and donors need to start funding ecosystems which can evolve and develop. But B, we need to come together to articulate what our field means, and then take that to policymakers and get them to start investing in social innovation, social entrepreneurship, whatever we call it, the larger umbrella. So I'm working with now around 100 governments, other than the European ones, not a few European ones. Nobody has a ministry for social innovation. Nobody. Now, how can we be a sector if there even isn't that recognition among governments? So for me, I think that's the number one thing we need to do, is we need to scream loud, talk, do whatever we need to make sure we have that. And then we will be able to bring about the change. Because then we can do what Andrew talked about, what you talked about, which is every enterprise is a social enterprise. But first we have to have our own common, blanket and things to make it happen.
Big question. I mean, I agree with Juru. I think there's still, the sector needs to be built and the ecosystem is still emergent. I would love for there to be the point where the best graduates don't feel like it's a financial choice to follow purpose. Because at the moment, the brightest and best will go into the big organizations who can afford to recruit. but what would it look like if the roles that actually people feel drawn to but have to make or feel they're making multiple years of compounded future opportunity cost? Until we can shift that, then, and it doesn't even have to be one for one, but just bring it closer because the gap is so big. And there is a mindset, which, you know, I'm guilty of, that if you're doing charitable work, you shouldn't be compensated. Like, until that shifts, that's the problem, because what we're inadvertently saying is the work is not valuable. And that has to shift so that working on solving the world's biggest social problems becomes the best paid activity anyone could do. I think that will create a huge shift towards this. But equally, I realize there's naivety in that because the markets don't exist and the cash flows are not there. And so it's not impossible, but unless we strive for that, I don't see how we'll get the size of shift that's going to be needed to solve the leading issues in the world. But I remain hopeful.
Can I give a slightly different point of view, if that's okay?
Go ahead.
I think, shouldn't it be the other way, that large corporations need to also have lesser payouts so that they come the other way too, so the two can merge? Because that's when the true systems change is going to come. That's when we can really solve the major problems of the planet. So I think we need to sort of move it both ways, because otherwise it's going to be this side stays and it doesn't change, and we have to change, but that's not going to work. We need to get them to change. Then we'll be able to have the large-scale economic shift.
I'm just going to jump in with one thought on this before we go to Cynthia. I think I've got a mic, which is, I think we need to get beyond the us, we and they, right? The us and them. And both of you were talking about unlocking financing, right? And sort of thinking about the resources are there, how are they distributed, right? And how can they be differently distributed?
I like all of these answers, and I think there are very practical things that came out of our research, out of the report, and none of these were things that we were saying that were brand new, but it felt like we were able to bring them all together into one place. Practical things like, what is the entity that you are going to use to develop your organization? Almost every organization that we spoke to had challenges with the entity types that were available to them. They often had to have two organizations, a for-profit and a nonprofit, in order to be able to access the financing that they need. Intellectual property, we haven't spoken about it explicitly, but in many cases, the actual time, the speed, and the state of the systems within which they were working to enforce that IP, they were non-existent. So they weren't able to actually take advantage of intellectual property if they wanted to use that, or if they felt that that was beneficial to their business model. Recruitment, talent. Drew likes to talk about what's the plumbing and the electrical for the house of social entrepreneurship. We don't have kind of standard employment paths for people to follow. When I speak to social entrepreneurs, my favorite question is, what's the journey that got you here today? Because it's always completely different. And that's not the case for other professions. There's a path that you can follow. So can we have role models, but also paths for people to follow in these career paths? So those are the practical things. And I would just end by saying that the last piece that I'm seeing more and more of, and that I'm excited about, is seeing how social entrepreneurs actually become kind of the conveners of many different cross-sector collaborations. So how do they sit at the nexus of government, private sector, other social entrepreneurs, other industry bodies, and how do they bring those actors together? I feel that there's innovation that needs to happen in the way that we collaborate and the way that we come together into collectives, and that we have so much to learn. And there are organizations, I saw it across all of these organizations that are doing that, but we're not recognizing that in and of itself as an innovation. So if we can study those things and bring those practices to the fore, I think I heard this beautiful phrase the other day, bring the drops together in order to create the watershed. And I think that's a very exciting way to picture this sector as it's growing.
That's wonderful. We're going to open it up to questions. So I welcome any of you here in the room, and then those of you joining online, put your questions in the chat, please. Yes.
His question was, how do you, if I can paraphrase it, how do you get the government involved and passionate in what you're doing? And I think my answer is there are really good eggs or good people who want to bring about change in government, in the private sector, everywhere. So it's finding them, and then they become your allies for the change. So it's just finding the right people, talking to them, and letting them lead and following, because they know their system better than we do. So that's
Hi, I'm Kamshi, and I'm studying a master's in public policy here at Blavatnik. My question is to the panel, especially on how are you, all three of you are in a position where you're talking about the ecosystem change. How are you actually speaking with the philanthropists, the donors, and the people who can fund the ecosystem? Because we see, as a political entrepreneur myself, we see a big difference in how we, like the entrepreneurs are thinking about it, versus how the people who are giving money to do the work thinking about it. So what's the lobbying or advocacy, as it is, like lobbying is not legal in India, but advocacy as it happens, what are some of the tools that you are using in your power and position and with other people in your sector to bring about change in the donor mindset?
So I'm seeing a quite exciting shift, certainly amongst our supporters, in that many of the philanthropists are talking to each other with social enterprises around what more can they do, how can they view their capital more as risk capital to unlock even bigger funding. So when we talk about kind of the total amount of money that's going into international development, only 7% is philanthropy. 93 comes from government international development assistance. So how can that 7% be used? And actually of the 7%, half of that is Gates funding. So when you talk about the philanthropists, you're talking a very small proportion. So thinking when they come together and they look at, well, how can we use our capital to unlock that much bigger pot of capital? And then actually when you step back, there's remittances. So people sending money cross-border to families is even bigger than all of that put together. So actually there is money in the system, and the opportunities, how does the philanthropy unlock the much bigger funding, which will create that kind of tidal chain. And I think there's a genuine appetite to say, this money is to allow people to try things that might fail, because the outsized impact is worth it if it lands.
in Catalyst, because that's where all the social entrepreneurs have come together. We have a donor learning group where donors are actually, like you said, talking to each other on how they have to shift their philanthropy and what they need to do. And when we started, it was over the past 2 years, I see a shift where people are talking more about the things that social innovators need, entrepreneurs need, unrestricted capital, etc. We also created an index which is asking donors to reflect on their own funding. And we saw 1,000 donors did take that. So there is, I would say there's an increasing appetite among the donors who provide the catalytic funding to make that shift happen. For me, what's really also very interesting is governments are starting to think differently. And I think that's where the largest capital will come in. So I think that's the shift which needs to happen. And if Brazil is able to get through its 2% tax, then it will be also very good.
Yes, Watu. Question is about financial sustainability, and how are you thinking about building a financially sustainable model?
Yeah, so I'd say my answer is I'm thinking about it a lot of the time. And my team and my board and I spend a lot of time grappling with this. And the reality is it's a challenge. We're trying to serve the lowest income people in the lowest income populations in the lowest income countries, and somehow sustain ourselves doing that. So the maths is difficult, but I believe possible, because the economic value created through the social change is greater than the cost of making that change. It's just where the funds flow doesn't align currently with a model that sustains it, which gives me hope that it must be possible. I think that's why I still wake up excited every day thinking, if we have a problem-solving engine, we'll eventually solve that problem. And so I'd say, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I'm convinced we will. We've already made a load of progress. And actually thinking of it, like the Amazon model, 20 years of loss making, it's okay to be loss making for a long time whilst you figure these things out on the way. because sometimes you actually don't know the problem you're solving or the problem you're solving within the problem until you have gone deep enough and long enough into it. So I, and we are now experimenting with different things, such as going from our current core customers are NGOs and governments who pay for our services, but we have to subsidize it very significantly with philanthropic income to continue. So we are loss-making if you only look at our sales income. However, we are now going to be spending some time experimenting with models whereby we're finding lots of people can't access philanthropic support for their treatment, and we will only screen and connect people for whom we know they can get care. So then that suddenly limits the number of people we can reach. So we're looking at a model whereby the economic case has been shown that if you get sight restoring surgery, your income goes up by $50 to $100 a month in your household, depending on where you live. And the cost of surgery is only 3 to 4 months worth of gained income. So if you perceive it as a cash flow problem, there's ways potentially of creating things like a microloan at the beginning, which is paid back once people see. And so we're experimenting with models that might change the way we can utilize the service we've built to actually unlock not just the social value chain, but the cash value chain and align the two so programs can grow. But we will need time to experiment, as will everyone else who's trying to build their own sustainable business model. But in short, it's hard and really exciting.
Okay. And then we're gonna wrap up after this.
I just want to add just a little bit, because I really like what Andrew was saying, and it was triggering something in my mind. I think that sometimes when we think about sustainability, we're thinking about the unit of analysis as being the organization. And I think there was kind of this, in the early stages of social entrepreneurship, this idea that the product or the services, the revenue was going to cover the costs of the organization, and that was going to be the way we were going to drive social change. And then there was this kind of reckoning over a period of about 10, 15 years where, in fact, many of those models didn't work. And in fact, Sasha from Soil walked me through kind of her whole journey about kind of coming to terms with the fact that in the case of Haiti, and I think, we're working in many different contexts, in the case of Haiti, a public good was not going to be able to be covered. The entire cost of infrastructure could not be covered by low-income residents. And so she came to this kind of realization that, in fact, she was creating a public good that in many developed countries, in fact, had been invested in by many different actors over many generations, and that she couldn't expect to have the burden of creating an entire public infrastructure be sitting on the shoulders of low-income communities. So I think when we think about organizations being sustainable, we should rather step back and think about how do we sustainably solve a public problem, and what are all the different sources and actors that need to come together to finance that public issue, rather than thinking of a single organization's sustainability as the unit of analysis for this question. I just wanted to put that in there in the conversation.
Thank you. And I think it really nicely highlights the importance of thinking systemically about this and of innovating on the financing side as we do that. I want to just turn to Sumitra for the last word before the reception.
Maybe I just want to pick up on the comment that you made, Cynthia, about IP. And, WIPO is sort of thinking about social entrepreneurship for the first time, seriously. I think social entrepreneurs haven't thought about IP seriously. This is a chance to actually bring the field closer together. So I was wondering whether you have any recommendation for one or two things that you think WIPO should be doing, and one of the things that you think social entrepreneurship, the field, should be doing in relation to IP, and how IP can actually strengthen your programs.
Another big question. I think first we need to highlight to social entrepreneurs what's the value of intellectual property, because for my very kind of selective group of social entrepreneurs, there was kind of this concept that the problems are too urgent and things are happening too quickly for us to wait to generate intellectual property, that the patent process is too lengthy. So I would say that one of the things that policymakers can do is make the process easier and more transparent and more enforceable. So that's on the policy side. But for the social entrepreneurs themselves, I think there's a real kind of aggravation between this idea that I'm going to protect a social good. That feels almost wrong and the antithesis of social entrepreneurship. So I think really thinking through how intellectual property can in fact enable other partners and other actors to be able to build upon the work of social entrepreneurs, rather than thinking of it as something that I'm going to protect this in my own walled garden. I think we can actually expand the way we think about intellectual property as being something enabling for the ecosystem, rather than just a competitive advantage for a single entity or organization.
Thinking a lot about this, and I think we need to move away from the concept of intellectual property to collective property. Because when we have the concept of collective property, then we can truly look at social impact which is happening. Because then we are able to really look at it and build it into our business models. And I think that's where also, like I was saying earlier, when the field was the social entrepreneur is the hero, the field suffered. It's when it moved to the institution, when it moved to systems change, is when the field has been able to grow. So I think with this whole debate of intellectual property, maybe in the social sector, when we are looking at social innovation, we actually look at the concept of collective property, social property, coin a new term and start that alternative thinking, which will therefore change the sector and also take away some of the very strong capitalistic structures. And I'm not saying anything for or against capitalism, but take away those capitalistic structures which have caused some of the social issues we are facing today. So let's think out of the box, away from current norms. And that's what you started with all those years back. So I'm going to put it back to you to think that way.
Okay, thank you, Jeru. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Andrew, Sumitra, Marco, Sasha at the WIPO and GII leads. Thank you. I want to thank again the other co-authors, Kevin and Anmal as well. And thank you all for joining us here for this discussion. I encourage you to download the report and the case studies. They're on the School Center website and on the WIPO website. And those of you who are here in person, I invite you to join us for a reception. And also please join us either in person or online for the next Insights for Action seminar, which will be Friday, 15 November. We'll be talking about the role of consultants and consulting in scaling impact. Thank you.